Hello and welcome to StratNews Global. I'm Nitin Gokhale, and you're on Books Corner, our occasional feature that is a video book review rather than a written book review of recent books. And my guest today is a famous author and, of course, former chief of India's Foreign Intelligence Agency, the R&AW, the Research and Analysis Wing, Mr. Vikram Sood. Welcome to this program, Mr. Sood, and this is your
Thank you.
latest book, your second book, which you've written in the last 4 years. The ultimate goal, how the former raw chief deconstructs how nations construct narratives. It's interesting that after your first book, which was the ultimate unending game, rather, which talked about the craft of intelligence, you have chosen to write on narratives and how narratives are constructed, or how nations have um, done global narratives and have won wars of perception. What made you write this book? What was the essential thought behind this book, Mr. Singh?
Actually, it started off as I was progressing in my career, and when you felt that what you observed was not being observed or represented the same way by another country in power, and what they said was different from what they did. Okay, and they would push. There was always a push towards an agenda, and that would come through in the media. I remember that I mentioned to others also. When the Iraq war started, the first Iraq-Iran war, how the agenda was pushed in the West, that how easy it would be for Saddam to score a victory over the Ayatollahs. And sure enough, the poor guy got carried away and he launched his war and they fought for 8 years for nothing. I mean, they achieved no result. But the West was able to get back into the seat in West Asia once again as a rival or as a opposing the Ayatollahs. So you started to think, and as you went on in your career, you realized that there is a game. There is a big game behind all this. It's not enough to have weapons. It's not enough to have guns, butter. And the economy is sound. The technology is sound. Everything is fine. You keep losing wars, and the image still remains the same.
That's right. I think the West perfected that game.
Mm-hmm. They perfected that game to the minutest detail. So I had a chapter in my last book also.
Yes.
Which says controlling the narrative, and this thing was weighing on my mind. And then after this first book came out, and I was told by a friend of mine, "Aap narratives will likh mari."
That's true.
So I toyed with the idea. The offer came to write another book. So there you are. I have this book now, and the more I delve into it, the more surprising or sometimes frightening it looked. How narratives are built and controlled.
It's in fact fascinating that you got given so many examples, and you make no bones of the fact that many of the anecdotes and incidents are sourced from Western narratives or Western, I would say, discourse. So in that sense, I think the West has really, for the last 150 years or so, as you mentioned in the book, has really been on top of this game, really.
Yeah.
But also, you mentioned at one place that the CIA has been referenced in popular movies and serials and dramas. But since you had headed India's Foreign Intelligence Agency, why is it that we've never had a realistic portrayal of the R&AW's own exploits or own tasks? Is it rooted in a larger narrative of or a larger failure on India's part, both as a society as a country, where we don't really set the narratives or the agenda, and therefore even our cinema or our popular serials and popular discourse doesn't really reflect what the R&AW has done and wonderfully well in many of the cases. Is that something that you have really seen or have you observed?
That's a good question, Nitin. And I think there's a mixture of so many reasons. One is the reticence of the R&AW to talk too much about itself. And unlike the West, where the intelligence agencies are a part of the society, as it were, and they're accepted to do a few things, and they take pride in that. We haven't got there yet. We are sort of there is. There used to be, I don't know, it's 17 years since I left. Maybe things have changed, but there used to be a kind of a disdain. Yeah, you needed the intelligence agencies, but you didn't want to see them around too often. So it was always good to be to underplay the situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think our media was really not interested in having a true portrayal. Bollywood, for example, we never interacted with Bollywood like the CIA did with Hollywood. They actually had a liaison officer posted there.
True.
Who had a job to do. We never thought of this. And I don't think it would have worked in our system. We're just not attuned to this. And then how many, United States is a major power. They have activities all over the world.
Right.
We have only two countries to deal with. Pakistan.
But we are thankful.
They're a handful. So there was this always the reason that, are we going to expose somebody? Are we going to expose our operations? So just leave it. We never got into this. But I think the time has come that we must operate through the Bollywood. And there have been a few films that are doing better portrayal than the earlier ones. And, I would like to. The Sunny Deol film was quite an embarrassment, actually.
And so I think that Jackie Shroff.
And so was Salman.
Yes. And also the Jackie Shroff film on what Romeo, Akbar, Walter or something that had come up.
I haven't seen that movie. I haven't actually seen that movie. I don't think I would be too thrilled with it, but never mind.
Yes. Hopefully, with the book that you guided me through, largely the book on the founder, Mr. Kao, and there are people who are working on a screenplay right now, but only on one episode of Bangladesh operations. Really, hopefully, it will be as realistic as possible.
That's the kind of thing you actually need for the country to show that. Things positive have been done.
Yes, exactly. So I think we'll have
if you rely on the Pakistani reports, then we are doing amazingly well. Even
I know. I was just going to ask you, when did you change your surname, really? Because if you saw the briefing,
it's so amateurish that you can't even spell a guy's name correctly.
Exactly.
Main rival, and you can't even get his name right.
So I was going to ask you that you seem to have changed your name according to the Pakistani surname. But they do give a lot of credit, I must say. Like in India, there has been a discourse in the past that ISI is like superhuman and 10 feet tall. I think that we've got over now, at least in the last 4-5 years. We don't hear ISI spy caught, ISI operative caught. I think
we had made a monster out of incompetence, really.
Exactly.
So it continued. But now it's okay. I think this professionalism shows in what they put out.
That's right.
or
Yeah.
lack of it.
No, I think it's more professionalism, but also, I was I was reading through the book and I was fascinated by the fact that you also observe that the Russians and the Chinese haven't had similar success in spreading their narrative or dominating the discourse through their narratives. Can you explain? I know you have explained in the book, but for our viewers, if you can explain, why do you think they didn't manage to do as well as the West?
First of all, the language itself.
Hmm.
You have to put out your story in the language most used. That is English. And I don't think until recently, neither the Chinese nor the Russians had that ability to, you know, to do it in a suave, westernized kind of way, which now Russia today is doing. I mean, it's very slick and very professional in their presentations, and they've got on to. If the Americans are to be believed on what happened with Trump and Putin and the elections, then they've done a fantastic job of changing narratives. If that is so, they've really changed the narrative in the United States.
True. I think they've been paid back their own coin.
Yeah, that seems to be a clandestine operation. It is not a through a process of building narratives through the arts, through the culture, through writings or books, as the West had been doing throughout the Cold War. The CIA would sponsor uh, theater, they would sponsor art exhibition, they would sponsor uh, music shows to get the right kind of people on their side.
Mm.
I don't think the Russians did that. If they did all this, this was a pure int operation.
Through social media, of course, but yes.
Yeah, and the Chinese are, I think, so far quite wooden and unimaginative. If Global Times is to be believed, then they're doing a horrible job of portraying their image, and they have a long way to go. But they will do all these. They will use technology more and more, rather than rely on this delicate issues. They just want to use technology and overpower you with ideas rooted through technology, not so much as art exhibitions or books authored by John Gunther and the likes, the Time and Life magazine. They don't have anything equivalent to that.
True. True. But those times were different. I mean, I think the Chinese and the Russians can compress time, unlike the earlier times, through because of the technology, because of the social media platforms that are available. But again, looking back through the 60s and the 70s and the 80s too, when you were in service, I think the Americans really Americans and the British through even mainstream media, BBC, CBS, later CNN. I think they really had a hold over the narrative when it came to projecting their interest and their achievements everywhere. What does India have to do now in the 21st century, in the third decade? We have entered the third decade of the 21st century. You had mentioned in your first book also that we have to really play catch up. But what is it that one can expect or one should expect from Indian decision makers, Indian intelligence to do?
I think today our media is involved in a media war of its own. So I don't think they are quite ready to fight media wars outside. Besides, the United States, first Britain, then the United States, built up their media centers of media with a lot of credibility. BBC was the go-to place for many of us. But has BBC reported or not? That was the yardstick. Okay. Now, maybe not so. Now they've got either we've got wiser or they got they've slipped up a bit. I don't know. Similarly, the United States, it used to be. It has been CNN, it has been New York Times, it has been Washington Post, it has been the magazines that they bring out, foreign affairs, foreign policy. These are the ones who give you your narrative. That is think tank plus media plus government.
True.
We don't have that here. We have a media who's obviously selling one line, another section selling another line, and then they compete with each other. But a national narrative or an international image is not built like that.
Right.
By all means, there has to be criticism of the government. There's no doubt about it. That if you're a free democratic society, you will have that. You should have that.
Sure.
And perhaps sensible governments need that. But if you're just going to have panel discussions and no other quality production, have you made any documentary? Any sensible documentary on the Indian environment? No, we're not doing that. We're only concentrating on these incidents.
It's about here and now.
Yeah, it's about here and now, just now, not even tomorrow.
Right.
I mean, why isn't a degradation of our air quality a headline issue every day?
Right.
Merely giving out figures at 459 hai, 437 hai. Why isn't the government asked to solve this?
True.
Why doesn't the media write more about this?
Exactly.
Because I don't think these are TRP issues. You see, therefore, that's why it is not taken up. But the protest and demonstration that follows from it, for the burning of stubble, is news. But the cause is not these.
Yeah, I think that gets the eyeballs, like you said, and also it can be milked for a number of hours, those protests, rather than just cold figures or cold scientific facts. So that's a lacuna that the Indian media has had for quite number of years, and I think we went from purely print media domination in the Indian media discourse to television without the maturity that is needed to handle television. I think that's one of the things that one can really trace at the beginning of this century, when television really took off in India. Television news took off in India.
Yeah, today this 24-hour news then happened.
And I think I've said this earlier, and I think you know my views on this, that we are no longer news media after 8 p.m. It's viewed media. It's one anchor's views, and then everybody else's views rather than news. And there's no facts that are available. There's no.
It's not about facts. Its opinion has become fact.
Exactly. So old timers like us, it's quite disturbing, because we used to be told there is a tight or a very strong wall between news and views. It should never mix. But today that is no longer there. So in the absence of that, how do we build narratives? I mean, my question, I again go back to the same question, that India, does it have to become a world power to become, to have that kind of narrative building, or does it have to do narrative building to become a world power? It's a chicken egg.
You have to do narrative building along with your becoming a world power. Your narrative must precede your abilities.
There you are.
You cannot do something and then talk about it. You must keep one step ahead. Your narrative should be one step ahead. And I don't know, it can't be done by a single agency.
Right.
It cannot be done by one group of newspapers or one group of TV channels. It can't be done by the intelligence agencies. It has to be a societal effort.
Right.
The West, if you see how they've meshed everything together, and it is not even a conscious effort anymore.
True.
It just evolves. It just happens.
Correct.
When you start talking about how important it is to go to the Iraq war and then keep beating that drum, 6 months later they say how bad it was and how terrible the Americans were. These are the Americans themselves saying it.
That's
And then
right.
it's over. It's forgotten.
Yeah.
Next. They go on to the
Correct.
next issue. But that's how it evolves.
Yes.
We have to learn that. We have to imbibe that thing that we don't have think tanks of that maturity or that ability or that reach.
Exactly.
Our own.
Yeah.
We should have our own facilities.
True. In fact, we have regressed in a way, because if you will remember more than anybody else that some of the bigger newspapers used to have correspondents in important capitals: Washington D.C., London, Brussels, Tokyo, even Beijing.
I don't think we have many people around, even in big cities like important cities like Beijing or
Just about those.
DC. What are we doing?
Exactly. So I think
Why don't we even have correspondents? I don't think they do in our neighboring countries.
oh, even All India Radio now seems to have given up. They used to have in people in Dubai, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, in Kathmandu. In fact, everywhere they.
I don't know how our overseas broadcasting service is working. Who's controlling? Is it running or not running? Is
Right.
anyone listening to them?
Correct.
So we have no audit on this.
Right.
Either government or an international private audit. But you want to be a superpower, you want to be a $5 trillion economy and so on and so forth. What are you doing to project that?
Correct.
And where are we projecting? How are we projecting? But here we're busy pulling down the government.
True.
That's
I think that's a big shortcoming, and in fact, we will. I was looking at one of the quotes in one of those discourses. I think one of the Harvard professors said that, and I think your whole book explains that very well. That today, winning a war or winning a victory over your adversary is not enough. It is also about how you tell the story, whether your story is ahead of the others. Now,
has to be plausible and acceptable. Yes.
yeah, exactly. So, in that sense, I think, would you accept, I mean, would you think, not accept really, but would you think that information warfare now is the fifth dimension of war? I mean, apart from space, land, air, sea, information warfare is the most important.
Definitely it is. I mean, I think I mentioned in my book also that military, economy, technology is not enough.
Right, right.
Now you can have cyber and you can have information warfare using the traditional methods and using the new methods.
Right.
So you've got to evolve your functions now, and you can't. You have to do it for the future. That means you must start today.
Correct.
Otherwise, the future will become today, and you'll have nothing.
Nothing. If you're not prepared and if you're not planning for the future, I don't think this can be won. But you also have, one very scathing sort of part of the book, or a section of the book, where you talk about India's new narrative. You say it is important, and I quote from the book, it is important to make India's past an inspiration for its future. The nation's new narrative must be multifaceted as a modern society, and one that is not stuck in the past. And yet, there is this discourse that has been deliberately done, as you also mentioned, and which I believe is true, is that anything you speak about Hindu traditions, Hindu rituals, are supposed to be condemnable and threat to all non-Hindus. How does one overcome this? Because this discourse seems to be getting stronger and stronger rather than weakening.
Well, it has to be. Then the other voice has to become stronger and stronger. The point is, if you first create institutions like the Minority Commission, then that becomes the hold of only one minority.
Right.
Then you are yourself creating divisions. You are encouraging people that you will get benefits if you belong to this. What you need is entitlement. What you need is affirmative action. regardless of your identity.
Exactly.
I am an Indian, that's my identity, nothing else.
Yes.
And unless we are able to convince everybody that your identity is Indian, you're not Hindu, you're not Muslim, you're not Sikh, you're not Maharashtrian, you're not Punjabi, whatever.
Sure.
There will be local issues. There always are. But
Yeah.
unless we are able to imbibe that or encourage instead vociferous tendencies, this is what it amounts to.
Yeah.
Of encouraging separatism, of encouraging separate identities. And, these tend to grow.
Exactly.
And appeasement is never an answer.
Right.
Political correctness that we saw in Europe is an example of what's happening today.
True.
You have that incident in Paris, and Islamists in Pakistan want the French ambassador to go,
Yes. Or in Bangladesh.
or in Bangladesh. So, what is it that we need to convince our people that everything is all right? Hindus are the largest in number.
Right.
Democracy votes for the largest in number,
Correct.
or by the largest in number.
Yes.
That doesn't mean by itself that it leads to Hindutva. It doesn't.
Mm.
But if some people start to see favoritism or appeasement, then there's a reaction to that appeasement which we have to guard against.
Exactly.
So my argument is that don't appease, but have affirmative action.
Exactly. I think more and more.
First thing you have to start with that.
Right. Right. And you also, I think you mentioned that one of the weaknesses that has never been fully addressed in India is the inadequate law and order machinery and the overburdened judiciary. I think that also gives an impression that we are not a modern nation state. I mean, we seem to be, we are a mix of various things. I mean, here we are trying to be infrastructurally modern. We're trying to develop waterways and roadways and airports. But at the same time, our overburdened judiciary and the law and order machinery, the police, don't seem to get the right balance. So that feeds into the negative perception that the West is so fond of portraying India with or in lights. And I think, but one thing that is changing, and I don't know whether you'll agree, but the West domination of the Western press or the Western media over the thought process in the Lutyens Delhi, if I may call that, the decision makers, I think has diminished, if not completely vanished. I don't think the Western media gets the same kind of salience or resonance it used to get in the earlier years. I think that's a good sign because that is something that one needed to do because otherwise their discourse of the Western correspondent based in Delhi would be taken as gospel. I think that has changed.
I think that's because our own self-confidence and the rise of what I call the B-town young, who are confident, who are doing much better, who want to know, who like to know the answers. So that has changed, and I have started reading the Hindi newspaper to see the difference of what is reported by the English papers and what's reported by the Hindi papers. There is a marked difference. Our English papers gave 4 pages of news about Trump's election or non-election. There was no mention in the Hindi newspapers, except one column or two here and there. The front page news was about Trump. Here we were talking in Hindi papers about climate.
True.
So there is a difference. They don't, in the West, they don't talk about Indian elections that way, except that you would have an op-ed piece in the Washington Post or by a New York Times, maybe written by an Indian, how some disparaging remarks about the Indian election.
The ABCD, as they call it, the American born.
Yes. So that has begun to change, and we just need to, I think, continue on that line that people will become more and more receptive of listening to the reading vernacular press. And anybody who reads the vernacular press will probably get a better idea of what's actually happening in real India, Bharat as they call it,
The real
in India, which they describe themselves. So that is how it has to be. That's where the India is. After all, if why are people surprised that Patna, Bihar voted the way it voted? Why do the women vote for the BJP? Because they benefited the most from many of the actions the BJP took.
Right.
Let's not forget that, especially
Correct.
the women. And
Yes.
that's in UP also, same thing.
And I think the English media in India also misses that largely,
Yes.
because they are caught in their own web of narrative that they've built, their make-believe world, which is fed by false ideas of secularism.
Yes. They don't want to. I mean, how many of them have even sensible, reasonable, sincere correspondents in the bigger cities of India?
Right. Right.
Except you
It's
might
all
have a
become.
Bombay edition or a Calcutta edition, but where do they mix each other?
Why go that far? In fact, the current standoff on the border, for instance, I think we've had so much commentary and analysis. I personally believe that today's media, social media, online media is full of opinions being passed off as commentary rather than fact-based analyses. And very few people tend to go on the ground or get details from the ground to report really. I think that needs to change in the Indian media discourse. And if your dream of an Indian narrative to win, like you've mentioned in this book, or India to become a superpower or at least become an influential power, the narrative story or the narrative has to be right. In that context, one final thought I want from you: can the R&AW or even parts of the government play a part in doing this, facilitating the narrative building, or it has to be just outside the government, really?
No, there has to be a central focal point somewhere to kickstart it. That you get talents together and you work out what your story is. First, we must know our own, what is the story we want to say, and then decide how it can be done. There will be an intelligence role if you want to portray, or there would be a military role if you want to show a movie on Kargil. Surely you have to have military expertise telling them how it was done. It can't be done only in the Filmistan studio or wherever. So, and if there is an intelligence angle, then they have to be told this is how it is done. This is how to make your story professionally credible.
Exactly. Without sounding to be
Without being, unless you're credible, it won't sell.
True. True. And so it has to be an all-out effort. I think it's not something that
corporate as our corporate sector becomes bigger and larger, there will be a separate corporate narrative, like Westerners do it. Americans, you know how much money the American defense industry spends in financing think tanks.
Exactly. In fact, you have a chapter, military industrial complex and its narratives.
Yes.
The Lockheed Martin, the Boeings, and the BAEs. And
they have lots of funds coming to think tanks. Then is linked up with the congressman whose jobs depend on the factory that is installed in his constituency. So he wants to make sure that the equipment is sold somewhere. Right. Maybe he needs a war somewhere, like Charlie Wilson's in war.
Exactly.
So you have all these these linkages develop.
True. And you must have credible voices then batting for you. I mean,
credible Indian voices.
True. Exactly.
You must have credible Indian voices that sell the India story to a pattern.
Right. And to the world, actually.
Not going off. We mix sometimes high principles with practical realities. In this game, you have to be realist and practical.
Exactly.
Those high ideals are naam ke vaste. That is the narrative.
Exactly. And the reality can be very mundane or hard hitting. Either way.
Yes. Yeah. And usually that's how it is. Both mundane and not very palatable to many. So that's
Exactly.
how it is. But you give it as a noble ideal and of bringing peace to the country or democracy somewhere else or human rights. But these are all weapons that you use. Why has not the West ever felt that there should be international democracy? Democracy among nations. There's no such thing.
They believe
it only
that kind of thing, basically. Jiski lathi
sovereignty is never equal. Sovereignty is equal, power isn't.
Power isn't, yes, exactly. So, but I think, yeah, true. And I think that therefore your book, I'm once again showing it to our readers, is extremely important for all of you to read and understand. And you mentioned it, sir, here, that it is important for the younger generation to understand why narratives are to be built and they have to be, it is important. I'll read out that last paragraph in that introduction. And I quote, "It is important to understand them and project their points of view if India is to build its own narrative. It is to them that this book attempts to explain how the real world works without being judgmental." I think fantastic lines here. As always, a pleasure to talk to you. You are, you are a thinker. You are a narrative setter, if I can call it that. And therefore, this always a pleasure to have a chat with you. I wish we could do a longer chat, but I think today's attention spans are always very limited.
Yeah,
so I think
I know. I do realize that. Yes.
I must thank you for your time and for writing this fantastic book. It's a seminal book, and I urge every one of you who's watching this to go and buy this book or read it, even if you have to beg, borrow, and steal. Thank you very much, Mr. Sood, for your time.
Thank you, Nitin. It was always a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
To you.
Thank you, sir.
Doing a fantastic job.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.